Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Future in Review podcast. I'm here with science fiction author and Future in Review advisor, David Brin, to talk about the moon today. And specifically, we're going to be talking about NASA's Artemis missions and the Lunar Gateway and the burgeoning robotic moon economy. So in addition to being a New York Times bestselling author many times over, David served on the Council of External Advisors for NASA's Innovative and Advanced Concepts Group, which supports the most inventive and potentially groundbreaking new endeavors at NASA for the last 12 years, a position he just retired from earlier this year. And a few weeks ago, I published a piece about the current robotic moon rush that's taking place. And David wrote back to me, "I disagree with almost all of your points here," which was a fabulous email to receive from David because I love it when people disagree with me. It's such an awesome chance to learn more about what I don't know and what you know. So, David, welcome. I'm so happy to have you here with us.
Well, Berit, anything for you and anything for your Anderson clan. I've loved you for a long time, all of you. So,
well, we love you too.
Let's see if we can dive into disagreement.
Yes, let's see if we can give our audience a more nuanced version of what's going on the moon. So there's been a lot of talk, I would say, and kind of like marketing recently about this new robotic moon burgeoning space. We've got new companies or existing companies popping up to send scientific payloads to the moon. NASA is working on a series of Artemis humaned launches, and also the Lunar Gateway in partnership with countries and space agencies around the world. I am curious from your perspective, you wrote in a piece, an interview I think maybe 2 or 3 years ago, you said, "Nothing will stop the Chinese, Russians, and Indians from going to the moon. What America should do is set up the Lunar Gateway as a space hotel with Artemis landers from Blue Origin and others, rent them out for exorbitant fees, and say, 'Welcome to the moon. Is there anything we can do to make your stay here more pleasant?'"
Yeah, well,
in your opinion,
it removes the most aggressive word. I meant to be ironically aggressive in that. Welcome to our moon.
I see. Because okay, important distinguishing characteristic.
Yes. Well, if any nation is going to claim it, it would be us, because by precedent, our explorers stood on it and planted a flag. Now, that's not policy, and I think it's right that it's not our policy. Our policy is that the moon should be the common heritage of all Earthlings, including those who don't yet exist 1 million years from now. And as a complete aside, but I'll offer this as a link for you to offer viewers, is how I believe our descendants might be able to use the moon to drag the Earth farther from the sun, because across the next 100 million years, that's going to be necessary.
Right.
The sun is getting hotter very gradually. Has nothing to do with climate change, which we should, but yes, it does, because Earth skates the very inner edge of the continuously habitable zone around our sun, and we can't afford a greenhouse effect. We can only afford as much CO2 as plants need, and no more than that. So across 100 million years, it's going to become impossible even to export the waste heat, even with the CO2 that plants need. So we're going to have to move the Earth. It's ironic for this ape to be saying this about our descendants, but may they be smart enough to use this method to pull on the moon that would then pull the Earth gradually to a better place. But that's not a use for the moon that we're going to have right away.
What is, in your opinion, I'm curious, in your opinion, why is NASA going to the moon? Because I wrote about helium-3 and you said that's ridiculous. There is no helium-3 on the moon. Or it has not yet been discovered.
Once you're ordered to make the change from the very sensible Lunar Gateway plan that NASA had to the extraordinarily silly Artemis plan, They were given that order by the then president of the United States, Donald Trump, and all it can possibly do is harm the United States space program. Whether or not that was intentional is something that it depends on whether you give me a beer or two or not. But the fact is that the Lunar Gateway gives us a sweet spot. The Gateway was planned because we can observe the moon, we can then supervise robotic exploration of the moon, which I'm all in favor of, and at
Right.
NIAC we helped promote the current era of boom of robotic landers on the moon to explore
Right.
four resources, to possibly prove me wrong about helium-3, to possibly find if there are meteorite debris fields where you could just drag magnets and get iron, for example. These are possibilities. And of course, there's the only lunar resource we really know of, and that's the polar ice fields that may or may not be mineable and turned into useful resources. There's certainly less water ice at the lunar poles down on the gravity well than there is in near-Earth asteroids. So if your sole goal is to get water, or later to get
water for use in space, right? It would be water
if
for
your sole is to get the water in space for uses in space, or if you want to mine and get valuable minerals, all of that stuff is on the asteroids, including some near-Earth asteroids that are easier energetically to get to than anywhere on the moon. Now, the problem with asteroids is it takes more time, and so it has to be done robotically. Time is the enemy of astronauts in space. And if it takes time to get somewhere, you're just going to destroy your budget just providing enough food and air and all that for the astronauts to survive. The moon is slightly better for astronauts, but it's still a plain of poison dust, these sharp, sharp dust grains everywhere that haven't been eroded by an atmosphere. They're nasty. So you need a good reason to send astronauts. And the best reason anybody has come up with is gestures of national pride and tourism. In fact, Andy Weir's novel Artemis, which, the author of The Martian,
yeah.
His novel Artemis makes the point that the primary use for the moon for at least the next 50 years will be tourism. And that's why I said what I said about the Gateway. One of the uses of Gateway would be as a hotel for visitors to the moon. While we're using the Gateway to study the moon, robotically and telescopically, while we're using the Gateway to inspect samples from asteroids, there's a dozen great uses for the Lunar Gateway in orbit around the moon. A hotel for tourists where we rent folks landers, and that way every nation can go down to the surface and have their rite of passage or their bar mitzvah, just like we did.
I can see it now. The Lunar Gateway, sponsored by Pepsi.
Well, there you go. In 1969, we had our bar mitzvah, and it was a bar mitzvah for all of humanity. And you look up at the moon, and you can say, "Well, we've been there." But
so, what would you? I mean, a lot of what I've heard from is that the moon is strategically valuable as a potential, essentially, gas station for other space travel. Do you have a perspective on that?
It's not. The point is that in order to use the moon as a way station to Mars, and a gas station on your way to Mars, you have to go to the moon and then go down the gravity well down to the moon and back out again. If you can get access to asteroidal resources, they are less energetic to get to than the surface of the moon. That is simply a fact. Now, the one use for the moon that definitely will happen is as a training ground. When we are going to go to Mars, we will do dry runs, however many are necessary, one, ideally, two, if necessary, three, of all the landing systems for Mars, all the stuff, we will train at the moon. It has that use. But the Lunar Gateway will serve the role in that training exercise of Phobos, which is one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in the solar system. If Phobos has volatiles under the surface, water, ice, CO2, something like that, and these can be mined in what's called ISRU, in situ propellant production, or resource utilization. If that can happen, and we know it can happen on Mars, we know that we can land factories on Mars, robotic factories that will fill up the propellant tanks for the return voyage. If you can also do that at Phobos for the landing on Mars.
So for those who are not familiar with Phobos, can you
explain? Phobos is the larger moon of Mars.
Okay.
If you can make a refueling and water supply station on Mars, which we're pretty sure we can do, and on Phobos, that means we can fire the astronauts to Mars super fast, carrying no fuel for their return trip. And that means that it's economically doable. That means let's go. But to do that, we first have to develop the robotic mining,
infrastructure,
refining of water.
So you're saying Mars. What I'm hearing from you is that the moon is really a testing ground for all of these robotic technologies for Mars.
No, it's a testing ground for the landing and takeoff.
Okay.
It has no resources that will be of particular use.
Right.
Maybe for the testing, you could use some lunar water, but I have to say we don't know how much lunar ice there is at the poles. If it's just megatons, it should be left for future lunar colonists who would curse us for having robbed them of their water. Now, if it's gigatons that are there of ice on the lunar poles, then it's competitive. And at NIAC, we did fund preliminary studies for mining lunar polar ice and refining it. But you have to bear in mind, the lunar polar ice is always in permanent shadowed areas. So that means you can't use solar power.
Right.
So we need breakthroughs in nuclear, cheap, copious nuclear power, or giant mirrors at the rims of these craters.
That kind of brings us back to the helium-3 question, right? Is that why there is such a fixation on helium-3 on the moon?
No, helium-3 is a snake oil sales pitch for to justify Artemis, to justify going to the moon. There are no scientific proofs that it's even there. Now, the notion is that ions have been blasted out of the sun, as we well know, because we're recording this during the Great Solar Storm in 2024, which, by the way, fortunately has not crashed any of our electrical grids. This is great news. Well, one hopes. There is, that doesn't prove that an EMP pulse can't do it. But it does suggest that we are more robust than we thought we were. But these solar storms blast ions into space. Most of them are protons, but some of them are helium nuclei, mostly helium-4, but some helium-3. The moon's been exposed to this stream for 4 billion years. So the notion is, and it hasn't been disproved, it just hasn't been proved, that there may be helium-3 embedded in the lunar regolith. And the best way to see all about this is a wonderful science fiction movie called Moon. Just a terrific movie. It's about cloning. It's about these robotic harvesters are going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, digging up lunar regolith, taking out the helium-3 by some process we have no idea, and then spewing out the regolith behind them. And this one guy is there to maintain them. Great movie. We don't know it's there. We don't know how to extract it if it's there.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know how to collect it if we can extract it. And above all, we don't have any customers because fusion power.
Because we haven't figured out how to use it yet.
That's right. Now, helium-3 in theory would make a pretty good fusion fuel.
Yeah.
Not as good as tritium,
Mm-hmm.
but to be honest, tritium, deuterium, to be honest, we can't even get tritium to work yet.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm hopeful for fusion power happening before I croak. But there are so
Me
many
too.
problems. There
Yeah.
are so many problems with fusion power. Even if we get self-sustaining reactions, we don't know how to get the heat out to run a generator.
Mm-hmm.
No one knows how to do that. So there's no customers for the helium-3. If you can solve all those things and start out by proving that it's there, well, I'm all in favor of landing the robots. And that's what we were planning to do anyway. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what's happening starting in this year in 2024.
Yeah,
There's a
so
wave
I was gonna
of
say
robots.
let's talk about that. So we do have part of the reason this came about is because there is this burgeoning new industry of scientific payloads being shipped up to the moon on behalf of countries and scientific institutions. What do you think is the point of? I mean, if what you say is true, which I trust that it is, what is the point of that work?
Oh, number one is science. We got
Right.
to find out. Number two is if it turns out I'm wrong. And by the way, I don't lay a lot of bets on there being no helium-3. That's the
Mm-hmm.
part that we just don't know.
Yeah.
I'd love to find out. I'd love to find out. And if we found it, it would be motivation
Right.
to develop some of the extraction techniques and all that. It's just that Artemis has nothing to do with that.
Yeah. I'm not even talking about Artemis right now. I'm talking about the scientific payload companies that are
Well, I'm all in
that are
favor of
yeah.
exploring the moon, sending robots, all that sort of thing. Oh, sure, sure, sure. That's what the Lunar Gateway is partly all about, to control these things, to study them, to use close-up telescopes, all that stuff. The Artemis program was intelligently designed before Trump. It
Mm-hmm.
was our plan. And thanks to Donald Trump's best by far appointee, I don't think he quite realized how good he would be. Bridenstine, who was one of the best NASA directors, NASA administrators, he managed to save NASA science and the Lunar Gateway from being raided for Artemis. And for that, we owe him a national sense of gratitude. As it stands, Artemis is not going to hurt us as
Mm-hmm.
much as it seemed it was going to.
So say more about that. What were you worried about when you say it would be the worst thing ever for NASA?
It being a grand um, national gesture to have a footprint stunt that would raid all of the remainder of NASA's budget.
Okay.
And basically,
Without a significant output or
right.
outcome.
And thanks to Bridenstine and a bunch of very clever people, it seems as if NASA has not been badly harmed by this and footprint stunt on a plane of poison dust. Let me give you one more reason why we shouldn't be racing to beat the Chinese footprints on the moon. I mean, there's this talk about if the Chinese beat us to the moon, they'll own the moon. Excuse me. By any precedent, if anybody could claim the moon, it's us. But secondly, it's all having a base on the lunar surface doesn't affect geopolitics on the Earth at all. It doesn't affect defense. Gateway could.
Right.
Gateway could
I mean,
actually affect.
that's what I imagine is the presence, right? So,
The gateway is a presence, and it's a presence on the high ground.
mm-hmm,
Um, but all of these justifications of geopolitical reasons to beat the Chinese, it just doesn't make any sense at all. But the number one thing, in my opinion, is uh, racing to shame them. We've already had footprints on the moon, and racing to beat the Chinese to the moon the second time is just terrible.
yeah.
They deserve their
It's a
national pride.
waste.
Why would we slap them across the face? Let them have their barmoons. Let the kiddies have the sandbox. We
Mm-hmm.
and the Japanese have business elsewhere where only we have done anything and only we can go. And that's the asteroids. That's where the riches are. I just believe that if you're going to be dignified elder brothers who have already had our proud moment of flag planting on the moon,
Mm-hmm.
the nastiest thing that we could do is hurry to beat the little brothers, the younger siblings, to their rite of passage and go, yeah, 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 we beat you a second time. I think it's bad politics. It's just dumb and it's dishonorable. Now, we're going to do it. And fortunately, there's a limit to how bad Artemis can mess us up because we're not going to order any more of those stupid SLS rockets. They've drained our national treasury long enough, and all we need is for Elon's ship to work. And here's the amusing thing. They need that ship to land Artemis, even if they're going to be using the multi-billion-dollar white elephant of the SLS to send the people there. So it's an incredibly dumb situation. But then again, I'm no longer have an official position, so I can
So you can say that.
I can say that.
The honest truth about what's going on inside at NASA. Brought to you by
I don't
David
know if that is
Brin.
the honest truth, but
Okay, so David, I want to end on, we were talking before the podcast started about your role as a contrarian optimist. And in this conversation in particular, you have been the contrarian pessimist about the moon, which I don't think is unfounded. That's just the contrarian's nature, right? But my question is, what in space exploration are you most optimistic about or excited about?
well, I mean, about 10 years ago, there were a bunch of billionaires who started companies like Planetary Resources
Right.
to
Chris Lewicki was
supposedly
a speaker at
mine
Fire. Yeah.
asteroids. And at the time, I said, whoa, even for you guys, this is way ahead of the curve. And sure enough, they all went belly
But
up and
they're
the
gone now.
billionaires
Yeah.
wandered off. What's happening is there is a new wave now
Mm-hmm.
of folks who are investing in these things. It may still be too early, but you can't beat the math. If you get the right asteroid, you get a lot of water,
Mm-hmm.
easier to get to than the lunar poles. And by the way, let me just mention on the side, the second thing that's really valuable that the Chinese may try to lay claim to is lava tubes on the moon,
Right.
where you can set up a base inside that's
Yeah.
safe from micrometeorites and radiation. If there's a lava tube that's right near the ice, that could be the most valuable
That's
place on the moon.
yeah.
And I think it's very important that we send robots there with little flags. But the Psyche mission, if it makes it to Psyche and shows us the extinct core of a protoplanet that's made of platinum and, well, we're never going to mine that stuff. It's just too hard to dig. But there are other asteroids that have platinum, iridium, cobalt, all these steel you would ever need, nickel. And that might excite people to look into this and start bringing the stuff home.
So you're an asteroid optimist, is what I'm hearing.
Well, yeah, just because you look at it where the riches are,
Mm-hmm.
go up, young man and woman, go up. That's where the stuff is. But
And are there any companies or leaders in that space that you think are particularly interesting?
well, there's a company called Transastra that got in Pasadena that got a couple of NIAC grants. They are studying both lunar polar ice extraction and ice extraction from asteroids.
Hmm.
So they are highly ecumenical about their moving forward, and I approve
Yeah.
wholeheartedly. Yeah. So that's pretty much what I have to say about how there's look. There is aluminum, silicon, smidgens of titanium in the lunar crust. You're going to hear that snake oil push to try to sell, a land rush there. Don't swallow it, because these aluminum and silicon and titanium
Yeah.
are in very, very tight oxides.
I mean that, and I'm not. I wasn't seeing much different than that in my research. Right? There's not a lot of
Yeah, yeah.
emphasis on.
If you want to see how hard that is, go to one of the big Brazilian dams on the Amazon, where they ship bauxite from around the world because there's a lot of electricity there. And it takes a lot of electricity to take bauxite, which is better than the ores on the moon,
Mhm.
which are ilmenites and things like that. But even bauxite takes vast amounts of electricity.
Yeah.
So if you're talking about silicon, titanium, aluminum on the moon, uh, be sure to ask the snake oil salesman where they're going to get the energy and what technology they're going to use to apply it to turn this. By the way, we did grants at NIAC on that specific question.
Right.
So
So that, I
I'm
mean,
all in
I feel
favor.
like this is the, yeah, I mean, that's very interesting and perhaps a good place to land, which is the preliminary question that needs to be solved in order for the rest of that to be useful and meaningful is actually about the energy source on the moon,
Yes,
right?
energy sources on the moon, and there are lots of ways to do that, and we need to make progress on portable nuclear, on being able to make solar cells maybe on the moon and just lean them. You don't have to
Distributed.
make any structures. You can lean them on
Yeah.
furrows. You get solar energy 2 weeks out of every four. So there are lots of ways to move forward. I've been proud for 12 years to be part of the NIAC programs, stimulating things that are just this side of science fiction. Lately, I've been just immersed in the whole great AI panic of 2024.
Yeah.
So I gave a keynote at the recent RSA conference in San Francisco. It was very well attended, 300 or 400 people. And then I attended Antony Blinken's keynote, where there were 7,000 people. So I was
Yeah.
properly in my place.
Well, I also attended RSA. I was not there for Antony Blinken's talk, but it was an interesting mix of people. Perhaps that can be the topic of our next podcast together.
Well, anything for you. And of course, we'll also be discussing the fire conference that's coming up, that I urge
Yes.
people to open their wallets, because it's the best technology conference in the world.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, thanks so much for your time, David. We really appreciate it. And we hope to have you back on another future episode of the Future in Review podcast.